Greetings, friends of liberty. Were you aware, perchance, that your modern word janitor is derived from that of the Roman God Janus? Yes, that ancient god of doorways and transitions and beginnings and endings, and from whom we derived the last month, that month of January. At least, this is what Samuel Johnson advised me not 2 weeks ago, he of the magnificent Dictionary of the English Language, in 2 volumes. And when it comes to lexicography, I shall certainly take Samuel's word for it. Now, if we proceed to your 21st century in North America, we find the word used in this book, The Faces of Janus, Marxism and Fascism in the 20th Century, by esteemed political scientist Anthony Gumiliano, now known as A. James Gregor, author of over 20 books on the theory and history of fascist and communist ideology and practice, who outlines the similarities and differences between fascism and communism both in history and theory. Gregor is certainly right that these two movements, like Janus, can sometimes look very similar. And yet he begins by emphasizing how very differently these two political systems have been regarded. The term fascism has been pressed into service to identify anything that could in any way be described as right-wing extremism. But Marxist or communist systems, on the other hand, were rarely treated with such unqualified condemnation. And so in the West, we saw the admiration with which Western intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Ignazio Saloni, Arthur Koestler, or Howard Fast studied the Soviet Revolution. I would agree, fascists and commies, although equally bad, have not been treated equally badly by Western cultural institutions. As Kate Winslet said, with regard to Hollywood around 2008, if you do a film about the Holocaust, guaranteed an Oscar. I've been nominated 4 times, never won. Schindler's Bloody List, The Pianist, Oscars coming out of their arse. And so it was no surprise, really, that when she finally won an Oscar, it was in her first Holocaust film, The Reader, playing a Nazi guard, and not playing a victim dying in the Ukrainian Holodomor or Mao's Great Famine. Regarding these two systems, most observers agree that they have much in common. As Gregor says, as early as the end of the 1920s, the London Times recognized the species similarities between Stalinism and fascism. And in 1934, George Sabine spoke of the Soviet Union, National Socialist Germany, and Fascist Italy as representing a new form of political regime, one governed by unitary parties that aspire to totalitarian control. It should be noted that he doesn't appear to call the Nazis fascists, but instead, as they called themselves, Nationalist Socialists, so a type of left totalitarianism. The question then that emanates much of the book is precisely how much Italian fascists on the one hand and Marxist-Leninists or communists on the other had in common. To highlight first the differences in theory, whether or not these turned out to be different in reality, he begins by outlining actual Marxist-Leninism as it was articulated when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917. This was, of course, the old Marxian fable, with Marx's labor theory of value and surplus value, how the capitalists allegedly robbed the laborers of their profit, since all the value of a product comes from its labor, not anything else like ideas or capital invested in machinery. And of course, the fable ended with the poor workers under capitalism becoming increasingly impoverished, thus motivating their worldwide revolt and ushering in the utopia of the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. This was the theory. Keeping Marx's blueprint in mind, he then, for much of the book, hammers home his argument about how similar fascism and communism were. Regarding these similarities, he says, firstly, in the 1960s and 70s, Stalin's heirs had inherited an arabesque political system, all but indistinguishable from generic fascism, yet legitimated by an ideology to which it bore no resemblance. And how is it different? He says, the revolution in Russia and the system Stalin had created gave every appearance of being fundamentally national, not international, in form and in inspiration. Secondly, he details at length the many nationalistic or fascistic thinkers that emerged in the communistic Soviet Union as it deteriorated in the 1970s and 80s. One, the nationalist Kurginian, who advised that the leadership of the Soviet Union would be wiser to abandon the values of the Enlightenment with all their associated passivity and political pluralities and reinforce the more traditional Eastern values of commitment, dedication, and sacrifice. The thinker Prokhanov, who saw the world as an arena for competitive confrontation with the industrialized democracies seeking the subordination of the Soviet Union to impose upon it an American future. And number three, the thinker Zyuganov, for whom Russia is the vital center of the Slavic core, and that core is the strength of a Eurasian bloc that serves as a geostrategic counterweight to the hegemonic tendencies of the United States. These are the three nationalistic thinkers that he profiles among others. Thirdly, there were many what were called Pamyat organizations, which were ultra-conservative nationalist groups, often anti-Semitic, which emerged in Russia. Alexander Barkakov's Russian National Union gave expression to a more sophisticated para-fascist political program, which was statist in orientation. B, along with Nicholas Lysenko, who organized the Republican People's Party of Russia. And C, Zhirinovsky as well, who now heads, ironically, the ironically named Liberal Democratic Party. What Gregor concludes is that in the aftermath of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there was an explosion of Russian nationalisms, each with its own statist and patriotic program intended to secure the salvation of the nation. But how strictly these nationalists can be said to be heirs to the Soviet Union's ideology remains unclear, since fascism can, of course, simply succeed communism. Fourthly, he makes the argument that since Russia and Italy in the 1920s were such fundamentally backward countries, unlike the fully developed capitalism that was supposed to be found in the Marxian end stage, Russia and fascist Italy really were quite similar in being industrialized by autocrats like Mussolini and Stalin, this again in a very different way than orthodox Marxist theory would have again predicted. So these are the similarities. Now let's proceed to the differences that he notes. Number one, he says fascism did conduct a long, violent struggle against socialist revolutionaries, and under the established regime, capitalists did make profits and property rights were secured. So this was obviously different from communism. Mussolini himself ideologically had also rejected the Marxist notion of a final crisis of capitalism, noting how prosperous capitalist countries were in the 1920s. The Italian fascists were sympathetic and encouraging to big business. As Gregor says, under Mussolini's regime, electrification was undertaken and rapidly expanded. The automotive and textile industries flourished. The communication system was expanded and rationalized. The banking system was centralized and rendered more efficient. The independence of traditional agrarian financial interests of the South were compromised in the service of northern industrialists. Number two, another difference. He noted the loosening of a degree of control under Khrushchev. He says, Khrushchev sought a half-hearted return to the Enlightenment and democratic values of the classical Marxism of the 19th century. There was even talk of political diversity and improved living conditions and the promised abundance of communism. So apparently this should count as a difference of sorts which Mussolini or Hitler didn't try. Excuse me. Number three, he argues subtly that the Soviet proto-fascism that emerged in the Gorbachev era was the spontaneous and reactive response on the part of Soviet intellectuals to a developing ideological crisis. So this would mean that this fascism was hidden before, or was it just emerging now? What then did this indicate about the real nature of communism? Wasn't it different if fascism was only now emerging? Number 4, he notes the habit among some European intellectuals of people switching from Marxism to fascism. He points out the example of the postmodern Paul de Man's uncle. Between the two world wars, there were many who made the transition. Henri de Man was a committed Belgian Marxist, judged to possess one of the finest intellects within the ranks of European scientific socialism. A socialist since 1902, de Man had become a fascist by the beginning of the Second World War. But again, since we can all agree that there are similarities between fascism and Marxist communism, like between cats and dogs, it's not clear what this proves. Were they the same always? Or did Henri actually flip, as it seems he did? Number 5, he points out that fascist intellectuals argued that the failures of the Bolsheviks in Russia were object lessons confirming the necessities of a market economy predicated on private property, the existence of a hierarchically structured state, and a program for mass mobilization in an enterprise of national regeneration. So this would seem to argue that at least some fascists understood the need for property rights more than the Bolsheviks did throughout most of their reign of terror. Finally interwoven with his attempts to show the similarities and differences between communism and fascism are constant references to major socialist or communist thinkers found in the 20th century and how they perceived fascism or communism. Number 1, so by the 1970s, Marxist ideology had started to change, and fascism was no longer identified with the final or general crisis of capitalism, but instead was supposed to help in resolving some of the nation-specific developmental problems of industrial capitalism under particular crisis conditions, like the Great Depression. Given that Italy was so poor and fascism could be seen in this light as trying to solve developmental problems, this was an understandable Marxist theoretical modification. Number 2, also in the 1970s, both the Soviet and Maoist thinkers turned against each other, each accusing the other of being fascists. In the process, they changed the previous definitions of fascism. Since Gregor believes that fascism and communism are very similar, he describes or quotes these thinkers at length. So, for example, the Red Chinese, to make Mao look good, simply redefined the criteria for telling whether one was a fascist by whether you agreed intellectually with what Mao said. As Gregor says, what was essential was one's ideological commitments. Anything other than Maoism was irrevocably and irredeemably bourgeois, meaning that fascism was the resistance of the bourgeois to the thought of Mao Zedong. And they claimed that in the Soviet Union, such bourgeois elements had succeeded in accomplishing what Hitler had attempted but failed to do. The bourgeoisie in the Soviet Union had defeated the Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat and had undertaken the all-around restoration of capitalism and the imposition of a fascist dictatorship. So the Red Chinese actually were accusing the Russians of being like Hitler and the Nazis. Number 3, on their side, the Russian Orthodox Marxist theory also, with its labor theory of value, the declining rate of profit, the inevitable growing misery of the proletariat, together with notions regarding a final crisis of industrial capitalism, was unceremoniously abandoned. This abandonment began especially when the accession of Nikita Khrushchev to the Soviet premiership allowed more criticism of Stalin and the orthodox theories he had held. The Soviets now claimed that fascism was characterized by state monopoly capitalism, which was characterized by militarism and having a chauvinistic leader. This new Russian definition allowed the Russian theorists to turn on the Chinese Maoists, claiming that the nationalism chauvinism, and racism of Maoism were ultimately due to the fact that most of the members of the Communist Party of China were of peasant origin. As Gregor notes, that Lenin and Stalin were both of petty bourgeois origin did not determine their politics, it seemed. That Mao Zedong was petty bourgeois apparently did. And just like with religions, one side could see the falsehoods of the other side very greatly while ignoring the beam in their own eyes. Marxist theorists argued that Maoists had used the entire notion of class struggles to suppress their political opponents who were often of proletarian provenance. This was true. Superimposed on this was Mao's cruelty. It was, we would say, the specifically imperial cruelty, the cruelty of Führerism, prepared to sacrifice the lives of millions. Maoism was a form of generic fascism. The Soviet conclusion was that Maoist theoreticians had reproduced in caricature almost the entire rationale employed by Marxists in the late 1920s and 1930s to characterize fascism. So some final thoughts. Number one, if I were analyzing fascism, I would probably include Hitler and the Nazis. It's not clear that Gregor does, confining himself apparently in most cases to comparing the Italian fascists under Mussolini with either the Soviets or Red Chinese. Number two, while it's obvious that fascism and communism as two types of totalitarianism are identical in many fundamental aspects, ranging from their hatred of any disagreement and public opposition, to using concentration camps or gulags to imprison or destroy those who oppose them, to their extreme disregard for life and property, to their intolerance to the existence of other political parties, to their adulation of their own autocrats and dictators, it also appears to me that they have definite differences. The first thing, and this goes without saying, is that their ideologies were significantly different, with the commies using Marxist-Leninism and the fascists nationalist or racial ideology to indoctrinate their citizens. As Gregor says, all fascist ideologues, whether social scientists, jurists, philosophical idealists, or apologists, explicitly rejected the classical Marxist notion that nationality and sentiment of nationality were simply reflections of elite economic interests. And given that you have complete despots, such as Hitler, if you characterize the Nazis as fascists and not socialists, and Stalin and Mao, the very fact that those leaders have so much power and have such a distinct ideology means that it's very likely that you will find some practical differences in these states as they evolve because they stamp them with their own ideology. Number three, excuse me. However, in the real world, communist countries in general have killed the people within their own borders, in other words, their own citizens, much more than fascist countries have. So typical examples here would be the Soviet Union with its 20 or more million citizens killed via mass famines and gulags, to the 40 to 80 million killed by Mao and other leaders in Red China, to the 1.5 to 3 million in the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Fascist countries, on the other hand, have tended to kill the people in other countries more. So fascist Japan before and during World War II, invading and killing somewhere between 3 and 10 million people, and Nazi Germany killing something like 10 to 20 million non-combatants, and perhaps 10 to 20 to 25 million combatants. All this means that fascist countries have tended to be more murderous internationally and communists more murderous domestically. Number four, you can probably argue that communist countries have tried, at least initially and periodically, to be communist economically. In other words, to follow Marxist doctrine. But since class envy and hatred of the rich make unproductive societies over time, communist countries have often changed to nationalism or racism to motivate their citizens. The Chinese communists, for example, were initially Marxist as long as Mao lived, but then, once he died, they used constant nationalism and quasi-racism to inspire as they became more economically open. Fascist countries, on the other hand, as Gregor pointed out earlier, and as Mussolini himself argued, traditionally have not, in the absence of war, tended to be as hostile to big business and property rights as, for example, the Soviets, who simply nationalized all businesses and companies and respected individual property rights less. So in conclusion, I would give this book a qualified BB+, since the author knows his subject like the back of his hand, but also since reading it will require either lots of background knowledge about the history of fascist and Marxist ideology or handy access to the internet. In addition, the author at times could be more organized in setting out his arguments, often going back and forth between different points in the manner of an excited Italian, which would be understandable. Nonetheless, even after this extensive reading about Italian fascism, I retain my love of prosciutto with melon slices. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.